Series has been a great showcase of all the talent that exists at Anshe Shalom, and I'm really excited to learn tonight. So please, without further ado, please.
Thank you. Hi guys. Okay, I'm just going to give out source
help you with that.
sheets, packets. Thank you so much. Okay. And there's more up here if other people come in. Okay. All right. So I'm really happy you could all make it tonight. Thank you for coming. And I'm happy you are all curious to know why the Dead Sea Scrolls are important, because I think they're crucial, and I don't think they're crucial for any reason that the Dead Sea Scroll exhibit in Times Square thought they were crucial, which was as a relic of the ancient world. And I don't think that's a compelling enough reason for why people should write dissertations on this subject. So thank you for this opportunity. So I want to discuss with you the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is this loud enough? Louder, okay. Tonight I want to discuss with all of you the Dead Sea Scrolls, those scrolls found in 11 caves throughout the Judean desert in the span of nearly a decade in the 1940s and 50s. My focus will be on the scrolls themselves, and specifically the ones relevant to biblical literature, and I will briefly touch on the society that produced them, though I think it's content enough for an entire separate lecture about the Dead Sea sect and who they might have been. This famous collection of scrolls is surely familiar to varying degrees to all of you, but my goal tonight will be to highlight two particular aspects of these findings that I think are usually not addressed outside of the academic sphere. One is extra-canonical or deuterocanonical literature, those texts that were not included in the Hebrew canon, and textual criticism, which refers to manuscript variances and different textual witnesses to the biblical text. Both of these things are relevant to the documents at Qumran, as we will discuss, and you will see. I'd like to first provide some brief background about the Dead Sea Scrolls, working backwards from their 20th century discovery to their creation in those centuries just preceding and possibly just into the Common Era. And then we can get back to these specific issues and look at some of the texts that were found there and see their importance. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd by the name of Juma Muhammad Khalil threw a rock at a seemingly cave-like structure, causing an unexpected crashing noise. And some of this story, I think, sounds kind of like Moses in the burning bush, there's almost a mythic quality to it, but there's a lot of attestation that this does seem to be the first way it was discovered. Which does not necessarily mean I'm questioning whether Moses really was at the burning bush, but that's another lecture for another time. Upon entrance, Khalil realized he had hit and cracked a pot in which a number of scrolls were contained, and he had literally stumbled upon an entire ancient library with numerous scrolls. Khalil contacted a local merchant, and he ultimately sold these scrolls, some of them for the value of about 24 pounds, to local Orthodox Christians in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Now, most of these scrolls are in Aramaic and Hebrew, some in Greek, and so therefore some of them were unrecognizable to the locals, and they eventually made their way to the attention of Eliezer Sukenik of Hebrew University and the famous or notorious, depending on your reading of 1948's events, the archaeologist then, Yigal Yadin. And through numerous excavations over the next decade, it was found that 11 caves contained scrolls, the most notable being cave number 4. And actually, you'll see on the top of your source sheet, it says 4Q Sam, which is kind of a typical citation form you'll see in academic literature referring to the scrolls. And you'll see, right, 4 is the number of the cave, Qumran, the book is discussing Samuel. But it's interesting, you'll see 4Q Sam a lot because it really does show the vast majority of the literature is coming out of Cave 4. So what was found at Qumran? So there was pottery and tefillin and ancient sandals, and then there were tons and tons of scrolls, about 800 fragments in all, well preserved by comparison to presumably the many, many scrolls that we do not have today. in the extremely dry conditions of the Judean desert, and a perfect place to house an ancient library. But we will also discuss the extremely fragmentary quality of these scrolls and the problems that that also poses. These scrolls include copies of all the books of the Hebrew Bible, multiple copies of each, with the notable exception of Megillat Esther. And scoring the highest is Tehillim, which has 39 copies in total that we've found, followed by Deuteronomy with 33. So the issue of why Esther is excluded is interesting, and the first main possibility is an accident of archaeology. We never were able to find one. The scroll disintegrated over time, and therefore they read Esther just like we do, and we just don't have physical evidence of it. I also think there's a more interesting possibility, which is the absence of the divine name in Megillat Esther was problematic. After all, the Talmud itself seems to have a quandary about it as well, and that's the first source on the sheet, which we definitely will not read in full, but it basically, I'll read the first lines and the last lines. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Esther Eina Mitame et Hayadayim. Right, so it's this discussion about what books cause impurity to the hands, which is also a lecture for another time about what is kind of the qualifying aspect to texts that are therefore going to make it into the Jewish canon. So there's an opinion that Esther does not cut it. And then there's a debate about the L'meimra de Savar Shmuel, Esther lav beruach HaKodesh neimra, v'ha'amar Shmuel, Esther beruach HaKodesh neimra, neimra likrot, v'lo neimra lichtov. Okay, dismissing that last point because I think that's an interesting separate question of orality. Really, the discussion here is about divine inspiration, seemingly, right? Was the text divinely inspired or not? And if it was, we can include it in the canon, and if it wasn't, we can't. But seemingly, divine inspiration, at least according to the Dead Sea sect, must be intrinsically tied, and arguably amongst Chazal as well, amongst the rabbis, with the mention of the divine name. Because the Dead Sea sect did preserve copies of the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, which does include the divine name in a number of interesting ways, which is source 2. So where it says LXX, that's just the general notation for the Septuagint. In chapters 4 and 5, there are two places where I think the name of God serves two different notable functions. So the first is the Greek version of Esther, which reads very similarly to our own, has a very large section in which Mordecai, upon finding out that Haman is going to destroy the Jewish people, prays to God. And it gets really theological and is, I would say, overcompensating for the absence of God's name in our version of the text. And it starts, Kyrie, Kyrie, Basileu, Panton, Kraton, Lord God, King, ruling over all. For all things are in thy power, and there is no one that shall oppose thee in thy purpose to save Israel. And it goes on with this lengthy prayer. And then later on, in narrative form, it's discussing Esther approaching Achashverosh when she's going to supplicate before him and say, your people need to be saved. And here again, it says, Kai mete balen hoteos to pneuma tu basileos. God changed the spirit of the king into gentleness. That's not my translation, but into gentleness, I suppose. Showing that, again, God is active in this story. It's not simply the characters or personalities calling out to him, but that he is an active player. So I think that this is very interesting about the way that they're interacting with the text and raises questions about the Septuagint. But again, so this is just some exposure right now to the fact that what texts are and are not included in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So now I want to pause and go to some of the other texts that are also included, because we mentioned that there is Tehillim, which has 39 copies 39 copies were found, and then 35 copies of Deuteronomy, and then 25 copies of First Enoch. And hopefully none of you are shocked to know that Enoch is not part of our canon. This book is fascinating and really unapologetically eschatological, meaning it's concerned with the end of days. And I only really think that Daniel, the book of Daniel, might somewhat compare, but this is really part of a genre of unique Second Temple literature that is preoccupied with the end of days and kind of this picture of Armageddon. And the very first chapter touches on this, and you have it in front of you. Divrei habracha asher berach Chanoch et habechirim ve'et hatzadikim. This is the bracha that Chanoch gave to the elites or the chosen ones and the righteous ones. And then if you skip down 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 lines, where he's saying, or 3 lines, Vayomer Chanoch ish tzadik asher milifnei Hashem nifkechu einav vayar chazion kadosh bashamayim. Right, he saw this amazing vision and he's attesting to it now. And he says, Ve'avin et asher ra'iti, I understood what I saw, v'lo l'dor hazeh, and it's not pertaining to this generation, ach l'dor rachok asher yavo, but rather to a generation that is far in coming, that's far from now. And it goes on to have this vayar et amsivotav, to have this kind of very elaborate, otherworldly, perhaps prophecy about what kind of the end of days are supposed to look like. So thus far, we see that outside of our canon, outside of the 24 books that we now associate as being the distinctive Jewish Bible, or Hebrew Bible, we have a collection of scrolls that are not our biblical literature, but were clearly very important to this sect. Yeah.
I guess you next source from the Book of Jubilees, but
yeah,
as I read through the Book of Jubilees, first or second chapter has this pretty long rant that seems to be directed at the Book of Enoch.
Yeah.
So, given that I think you're going to say the Book of Jubilees is important to them, how do we reconcile that?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I have an answer to that offhand. That's a very good question. I mean, it's interesting, though, that you bring that up, because I think people often discuss the Dead Sea sect as a sect, and clearly they're just in opposition to everyone around them. And that's the way that the discourse is usually managed, is saying there were all these, sectarian divisions in ancient Israel, and therefore this homogeneous sect of the, in the Dead Sea all must have agreed with each other and were different. So I wonder if that speaks to the fact that there was kind of a plurality of opinions about it within the sect itself, and some did appreciate Enoch, and some were having kind of a canon debate of their own in the community. I don't know if that's satisfying. I don't know.
Is the Book of the Teacher or something like that, also seems to be very important, and that also seems to be agreeing with Jubilees, so...
Right.
So...
I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I'm interested to look into that, though.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's a good segue into Jubilees, which is, I think, my favorite Deuterocanonical book. So the Book of Jubilees is, I think, a fascinating book that's it fits into the category of the rewritten Bible genre. So it's basically a retelling, and you can find many translations online. I highly encourage everyone to look at it. It's really interesting, and it's basically a retelling of the book of Genesis and about the first half of the book of Exodus, with some major changes, and it kind of artistically retells and interprets the stories that we're familiar with. It emphasizes law, the Jewish calendrical system, or the version of the calendrical system that the authors believe we should be following, and they believe the vast majority of their contemporary Jews are not following, and Jewish festivals. And it raises important questions about how the Book of Jubilees was supposed to be read, whether it was always seen as kind of a separate book from the canon, or whether it was seen as holy or inspired literature to the Dead Sea sect itself. And if you turn to page 2, sorry, it's not numbered. There's just two interesting kind of excerpts that I think are good examples of that, just to get a good taste of the book. So chapter 3, it's discussing, it's a pretty long book covering not that much ground. So, you're at chapter 3 and you're still like working on, on like the very beginnings of creation. I think like the Torah has a quicker pace, but it discusses that Adam is created and the rib was his wife. In the second week, he showed her unto him, right, presumably meaning sexual intercourse. And for this reason, the commandment was given to keep in their defilement for a male 7 days and for a female twice 7 days. And then if you skip down to number 3, right, it discusses childbirth. The reason the commandment is written on the heavenly tablets in regard to her that gives birth. If she bears a male, she shall remain in her uncleanness 7 days, according to the first week of days, etc., etc. So this is also an interesting document to compare it with kind of proto-rabbinic literature, that they're familiar with things that the Gemaras and the Mishnah are going to talk about also in terms of purity and impurity. And the Dead Sea sect, parenthetically, was known for their preoccupation with purity and impurity. So it's a very interesting text that is kind of working to interpret and inject mitzvot and halacha into a text that I think is already pretty concerned about mitzvot and halacha, even more so. So these texts are interesting, but there is more to that. These are texts that urge us as modern thinkers and modern Jews to question our own assumptions about how concretized the Hebrew canon was, and about the very nature of canon, of what it means to have a set literature. And I think there can be kind of simplistic theological satisfaction that one gets from simply believing that the texts of the canon were always limited to the 24 books that we have today. However, I would argue that the Dead Sea Scrolls are an excellent example of how we have to read Talmudic passages like the first one that we looked at discussing, right, should Esther be included or not, as probably more of a descriptive discourse about what should be included than a prescriptive one. That a lot of times I think, and again, I think there's definitely room to argue, but I think that the Talmud and rabbinic literature, and we ourselves are engaging in discussions about, well, what should be included and what shouldn't be. When I think already by the time of the Gemara, they're having that discussion as if it's a live debate, but it's not anymore, right? Esther's in by the time that they're discussing, should Esther be in? Because they're discussing it in Masechet Megillah, right? It's surrounded by a discussion where they clearly think the Megillah is very central. And I think the Dead Sea Scrolls are a perfect example of how we can't just kind of sit too comfortably looking at the Bible and saying this is how it always was. Because I think if we were Jews during the Second Temple period, it was not such a static set of texts that defined our people. And this brings us, I think, and hits its apex with textual criticism. So if you'll look at the bottom of what is page 2, it says an excerpt from BHS. BHS is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is basically a critical edition of the Masoretic text, which is the main text that we use today, which was a text that was finalized, right, which is a version, basically, of the Tanakh. It was finalized between the 7th and 10th centuries throughout kind of Bavel and then into Eretz Yisrael. And they were kind of our forebears, I think, in terms of textual criticism, and they were aware that there were multiple Hebrew manuscripts of the Tanakh in circulation with slight variations between the texts. And we find that with the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, if we compare the scrolls with each other and with our Masoretic text, there are variations as well. So one little example that I think is just helpful here, this is the section in Deuteronomy, right, that comes up at the Seder about, when your son is going to ask you what happened, okay, or what are our rules, and we're going to discuss the Exodus. So if you look at verse 20, there's the big space, and then it starts with ki. Ki ish'acha vincha machar lemor, mahedot v'hachukim v'hamishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu etchem. right? When your son is going to ask you, what are the laws that God has commanded us? So if you look, sorry, it's a little blurry, but after P, there's a little A, and on the bottom, that's the apparatus, and that is doing the work of manuscript comparisons to tell you if the text looks the same in all the other manuscripts that we have. So if you look at number 20, which you'll see it's the second to last line of the apparatus, or the footnotes at the bottom, you'll see MS, right, the manuscripts, and then it has two odd symbols. The squiggly line usually is a reference to the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is a fascinating, interesting, different version of the Chumash from what we have that was kind of created and propagated by the Samaritans. And then the fancy S is one of the main versions, again there are multiple ones, of the Septuagint. And then it says Vihaya, right? So we have a number of other attestations that really this verse starts, Vihaya ki yish'alcha v'incha machar lemor, right? Which also sounds, I think, just as good in terms of typical creations of biblical verses, right? It's following a general pattern. So that's just a taste of what textual criticism looks like and how it works. And I would say that our usual Tanakhs, if you have a Koran Tanakh or an art scroll, right, intentionally doesn't have this apparatus. Part of it is because it's a mess and it's hard to read, and most people, you're looking it up to follow along in shul or to study on your own, and it's usually the text itself you don't want to compare. But I also unfortunately think that sometimes it's an effort to avoid discussing the apparatus. It's an effort to avoid discussing these variant texts, because that destabilizes the idea that we have a wholesome canon whose versions never changed and look exactly the same. And I think that the Dead Sea Scrolls really disrupts that stability that we have. And it really challenges our assumptions.
I mean, there are multiple places in Jewish canon where we acknowledge textual variants. The most famous one is in the Talmud Yerushalmi Ketubot, where we talk about the three Sifrei Torah and the Beit Midrash. So it's like we discussed it. It's not like it's necessarily being hidden. It's just that I guess most people just don't find it as important.
I mean, I think that kind of more ancient Judaism found it interesting, and I think Chazal knew about it, but I don't think it's discussed in layperson context today, right? I think Kriyuch Tiv, right? What's Kriyuch Tiv? Okay, right, that's the marginalia, right, that's telling you, is it lo with a vav or lo with an aleph, right? And I think a lot of people, they say both versions were like divinely given to Ezra when he, wrote down they contradict each other, usually directly, right? So I think Chazal is aware of a lot of this stuff, and I don't think it's discussed now outside of the academy. Mm-hmm.
Were there any portions of missing portions of the Tanakh that were hypothesized from textual analysis and then proven by that they exist in the manuscripts and Dead Sea Scrolls? Like there may be a discontinuity in the story, and so there's this hypothesis that somebody must have edited this out to put it together with something else. But if only we could find a version pre-edited, and then they found it in the Dead Sea. I
right.
An anecdote of that though.
So I mean, proven is a hard word, especially with Dead Sea Scrolls and studying this in general, because the question of the or text or the most original text is really almost impossible to figure out. There is an example of that comes to mind that I can look up for you after, where there is some story.
Probably.
That's one. Also, Cain and Hevel. I think there are insertions of, right, there's a weird, there's an oddity in the story, right, that it says that they went out into the field one day and Cain rose up and he said to Hevel and he killed him. And that's our version. And that makes no sense. And at least by the shot, right? He said what, and there's no quotation, unless the quote is, and he killed him, which doesn't fit with the plot, I think. And so there are insertions, and Josephus definitely seems to think that lots of action happened there, and he's happy to narrate what they said to each other and how they went back and forth. So I think there are definitely places. There is another example that's not coming to me right now, where I think there's at least a strong argument in favor of thinking that a text that we have in the Masoretic text is more fragmented than it originally was. And then there are lots of, and we will look at some, actually we can turn to it now on the next page. Here's an example, though, that will show you how complicated it is and how sometimes it's hard to decide between what version is most correct. So this is the beginning of Exodus, of Shemot, and the top version is the Masoretic text. Ve'ela Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma, right? These are the names of the children of Israel who came to Mitzrayim at Yaakov, Ish Uveito, sorry, my staples, Ba'u, and then it lists the names, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, Uvinyamin, Dan, V'Naftali, Gad, V'Asher, Vayhi, Kol Nefesh Yotzei, Yerech Yaakov, Shiv'im Nafesh, V'Yosef Hayav Mitzrayim. Okay, so it lists the names of all the people who came down, the descendants, and it says that there were 70 in total, and that Yosef was presumably already in Egypt. Now again, 4Q, right? This is also a version of Exodus from the fourth cave, and the B also shows that there were multiple copies of Exodus in the cave. Now this also proves how fragmentary it is. So in the brackets, Eila Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma, or here this is interesting. It says Mitzima, and I'm not sure if that was probably this is all a reconstruction. So that whole section, we don't actually have on the scroll. It's missing. It cut out. So that's someone who says, okay, well, that probably started. The verse looks similar, so let's insert that. At Yaakov Avihem, okay, so that doesn't exactly match. At Yaakov Ish Uveito. But again, both sound good, right? Ish, and then it inserts Vit Uveito, Baru, Vain, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, good, that matches. Yisachar, Zvulun, Yosef, okay, Uvinyamin. So it adds in Yosef, which our text doesn't have. Our text brings Yosef up at the end. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Ve'asher, Vayhi, Kol Nefesh, Liyaakov, right, not Yotzei Yerech Yaakov, not coming out from Yaakov, but, you know, every soul to him. Chamesh ushivim nafesh. So the math is different. We have 75 people. Well, our text has 70. And again, the math of this section is hard either way, and the Parshanim, the commentators, are going to bend over backwards just to deal with our text, which is problematic enough. When I say our text, I mean the top text, the Masoretic text. But that's an example where, right, which one is more original? I mean, can anyone here make a good argument for which one you would choose?
Our version makes more modest claims, only 70. So
Exactly. So we learn good midos from the Masoretic text. But beyond that, right, I think that says a lot. Which one is more compelling? I don't think either. I mean, or I think both, I should say. Right, they're both compelling. Or what about the next example? Right, here we have, this is from Shmuel Aleph, right, 1 Samuel, chapter 1, right, and this is the story of Hannah, and she wanted a child, and she prayed, and she went to Eli, the priest, and she said, please bless me with a son, and you know, he says it's going to happen. It's a kind of weird exchange, again, just dealing with the Masoretic text. But here, you'll see the Greek is on one side because it's comparing the Septuagint and 4Q Samuel. It's comparing also the Dead Sea Scroll version. And on the right side, you have the Masoretic text. So our text says, Ach yakem Hashem et dvaro. Right, et dvoro, actually. That's a little odd. Right, but Hashem will fulfill his words. Okay? So again, who's he? Does that mean that it will be the words of Eli, or it's going to be God's own words? Probably. And then in the Dead Sea Scroll version, Ach Yakem Hashem Hayotze Mi Picha, right? It's going to be the words that come from his mouth. And again, maybe I should have included it. This I really excerpted from an article that's discussing textual variants. And the writer says above this, she's kind of a major scholar of it, but I can't pronounce her last name, sorry. She's Norwegian. And she says this is really one of those instances where she said, I can't tell if one of these texts is a corruption of the or text, of the original real text, or if one of them is a variation. I don't know which order this is going in. I don't know which one came first. So even scholarship itself, I think, is puzzled by this. And again, something that I think is kind of a humbling reality for myself and anyone else who's interested in textual criticism is the fact that so much of this stuff is reconstruction, right? And it's an amazing find to have over 800 scrolls or fragments of scrolls, but then you realize how much needs to be filled in order to actually make any of the verses even recognizable. And so again, if you look underneath that, Jeremiah 9, okay, so these are a few verses, again, from Jeremiah, Koamar Hashem, this is just, his nevuah, not to minimize it, but this part, we're not reading for content. I just want you to see, this is so full, right? Koamar Hashem, Al Yid Halal Chachman B'Chachmato, V'Al Yid Halal Hagibor B'Gvorato, Al Yid Halal Ashir B'Ashro, Ki'im B'Zot Yid Halal Hamid Halal, etc., etc. So if you turn to the next page, this is the Dead Sea Scroll version of that. You'll see the bracket. That means that part is missing until the next bracket. So blank, 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 b'chachmato v'al yid halal, blank, blank, mishpat u'tzedakah ba'aretz. If you turn back and see how far it takes from some of these words to the next one, I mean, it's almost complete verses that it's skipping, right? We're missing the vast majority of this. And I remember when I first studied this, and it was, midway into the course I was taking, and I felt really invalidated. Like, the work that we're doing doesn't mean much because this is all speculation, right? So much of this, we just don't know what they had written. And I can't imagine the extent to which we could even do more textual comparisons if we had all the missing texts. And if they hadn't disintegrated, we would probably, I think, see much more of a difference between some of their versions and the Masoretic text.
That the gaps where you don't have anything are bigger than they would be if the text was equivalent? Or
So if I understand you correctly, the gaps are showing that these are parts of the actual scroll that we don't have anymore. So if you can see the words on the left-hand side, most of them, there are variations, but they do map on to our Masoretic text from the page before.
Oh, okay.
But there's huge gaps in between them where the verses are cut off in the Dead Sea Scroll.
Like, are the gaps, like if you were to pencil in the
Yes.
words that in the Masoretic text into the gaps, would it fit? Or
Yeah, and that's a good question, and that's actually why it's structured the way it is because people have tried to do that, and they're breaking up the lines the way that they do it, usually not only because of the verses, and actually not at all because of the verses. On the right, you see, right, some say it's verse 23, and then the next one in parentheses says 24, 25, right? So they have multiple verses on some lines have 3 verses. So somebody is looking at this and saying, okay, we have the shape of what we think is the approximate width of this scroll, and now we're going to try and see if we could pencil in, hopefully no one actually penciled anything in, right, to the scroll to make sure it fits. This is where we would end up at the end of the line. So presumably it's supposed to look like this shape, if that makes sense to you. Yeah.
I think
Jeffrey,
what you might have been trying to get at is that if the shapes were different, we might infer something about what they had
Yes.
there originally.
Yes, that's also true. And there are instances of that, right? If there's a huge gap, or more likely, if there doesn't seem to be a big gap, then perhaps they had a smaller text than we do. So another issue that I think is very important that has to do with textual criticism are the issues, and again, and we'll get back to the fact that some of this is, I think, very uncomfortable to someone. And again, this discussion is kind of the way that academia stays alive, but it can be very challenging, I think, to traditional Jewish beliefs in a stable text and a stable canon, and the stable transmission of the text. And I mean, this was kind of the quote that I was thinking of ending on, but I think it goes much better here, which is at the very end, right, the quote from Pirkei Avot, right, that tells you the transmission of the Torah. Moshe kibel Torah miSinai, u'mosra li Hoshua, right? Moshe got the Torah from Har Sinai, and he passed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the Zikanim, to the elders, and the Zikanim to the Nevi'im, to the prophets, and they passed it on to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, right? Kind of the people in power. And I mean, there are multiple interesting critiques of the historical fallacy that this shows, that it for multiple reasons, political and otherwise, it probably didn't exactly look like that. And I think a lot of ways this is another place where the Mishnah is being prescriptive of what it wishes happened, possibly. That it wishes it looked this simple. It wishes that it was straight from Moshe, and it ended up the exact same way at the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. But in reality, this doesn't account for, let's say, scribal error, right? This is all being passed down. These issues, these texts are being propagated and are being, what's the word? Are being, whatever. There's a word, that they're being circulated, right? And it's human hands that are doing that, right? And even if the origin you believe to be divine, you still have human hands that are determining what the text is that you actually read. And there's a whole subfield of what scribes did, and scribalism, and the common mistakes that people would make, because there are patterns to these problems. So some of them are actually quite interesting, and I think worth mentioning. So some of them, and they all have very fancy, unpronounceable names. So there's haplography, homeoteleuton, homeoarcton, dotography, mater lectionis, the issues of lectio difficilior, and brevior. So, okay, what are all these? Makes no sense. Some of them make sense. So one of them, so the issue of lectio difficilior, it has an iffy pronunciation because I have no Latin, right, is the idea that the more complicated the text is, right, the less the text seems to make sense, the more original it must be. So that might sound a little backwards, but the argument is only a text that saw a complicated text would try to make it simpler, would say, oh, you must have meant this, and you kind of forgot out a word, I'll add it in. And therefore, if the text is easier to understand, it's less original. Now, this is very difficult to determine, right? And it's a bit of mind reading of like, what was the scribe thinking, 2,000 years ago? And I wish I should have brought another example, but there are many places where it's unclear which rendering is more confusing, right? So you'll have one that says one word and that doesn't make sense, and another that says another and that doesn't make sense. And you realize that you've landed in the same place. So this one idea has come under a lot of scrutiny, but it's important to realize that that's one consideration to take, that some of these variants, scribes might be trying to explain something, and therefore they're making it simpler for you. So another one is the idea of pietistic rendering, right? So that means that basically somebody saw the original text and said, well, let's make it more from, essentially. This seems a little bit theologically troubling, or I don't like the fact that, I didn't bring in a good example. There are a bunch if you compare the scrolls with our text of Chronicles, where you see a lot of comparisons there with Divrei Hayamim, of seemingly pietistic renderings where it seems that someone is making additions, again, depending on which variant you're looking at, to make the text seem more theological, or to even insert God's name where it doesn't need to be inserted. And again, many people would say that shows that that scribe is inserting it. All those names of God didn't need to be there. The text still makes sense, but really they're just adding it for their own theological purposes. There are also just some interesting ones in terms of simple script, like dittography, right? Like ditto, right? So you write the same letter twice accidentally. There's also homeoarchton, homeoteleuton, right? So homo, the same, teleuton is like telos from the end. Okay, so sometimes it's the ending of a word will share the same letter as the following word, or homeoarchton, where the beginning of a word shares the same letter as the ending of the last word. And therefore, sometimes the scribe will leave out one of the letters, so the word becomes blended together, which is a pretty understandable mistake. And especially some of these, if you look on certain, especially with the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you look on certain Dead Sea Scroll documents, you'll see that there are sometimes no spaces between words anyway. So sometimes it's very hard to actually parse out, even if you're you've memorized the text, to actually read it still feels bizarre. And therefore it's very easy to make those kinds of scribal mistakes. And so again, we have variations between the manuscripts of those. So ultimately, the Dead Sea Scrolls are a corpus of texts. And again, I haven't addressed the ones that apply to the sect themselves, right? Do you?
Just so does that have to be a mistake, or could it have been on purpose? Because I know in typography there's certain, there's two letters that go together. It makes it easier if you just leave out.
That's a really interesting question. I guess the simple answer is no, it doesn't have to be a mistake. I think sometimes, what comes to mind for me is there are interesting cases where even though it might be, there's one example where whatever the word is, right, it ends with two mems. So it's mem and mem sophit. But if you happen to just have one mem at the end, it just creates a different word, but it's still a word, right? So it's kind of like you make a typo, but it's actually still a word. It just doesn't exactly fit, or wasn't what you meant. So there are definitely cases like that where and either it's a convenient mistake where the scribe did mess up, and fortunately it turned into a word. It's still, you tried to write live and you wrote love, and fortunately you pressed an O and it was still a word. Or he intentionally thought, well, the text I'm copying from is a little blurry, and I can't tell if it's an I or an O, so I'm going to put in an O. So there are issues like that, where again, some of it is mind reading, and you don't know what the scribe is thinking. But you try, and you can make a living off of that. So all of these, so these are manuscripts, and they're extremely useful. And again, like I mentioned in the beginning, I went to see the Dead Sea Scroll exhibit when it came to Manhattan. And the way it was advertised is, see these ancient, there was a great quote, it had no substance to it. See this exhibition of, great ancient artifacts from the Holy Land that, were studied by ancient people 2,000 years ago. And I think that really doesn't get to any of the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't think that makes them relevant at all. It makes them interesting. It makes it a cool artifact to show what ancient life was like. But they're really relevant, and they're crucial for us to think about, both to raise questions about scribal variants, about textual witnesses, about scribal error, and intentional tampering with the text. And ideas of canonization, and what did the ancient canon look like, and were our Jewish, ancestors in the year zero, when you said the word Tanakh or Bible, did that look anything like what it looks like to us? And if one begins thinking too hard about these issues of textual transmission, the way the text looks, the books that are included in the canon, the mystique of divine authorship, And the idea of perfect transmission, right, from Har Sinai to Moses to us now, becomes very destabilized and very threatened. And I think this destabilization is great. And I think it is so important, and I think that our Judaism has to be able to engage with it. This destabilization is something that I think that the religious community doesn't often embrace, and it makes a real chasm between the academic study of religion, which is often deemed as taboo, and kind of the religious perspective, which is Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, and that literally is what happened. And again, even if that is what happened, there still were scribes, right? And the writers of the Mishnah knew that there were scribes, right? They might have been scribes themselves. All of our beliefs, particularly those with historical claims or contingent on historical claims, like the history of a text creation and a text development, need to be interrogated. And I think that it's intellectually dishonest to try and whitewash these issues. And in some sense, I think, I think it was Yeshayahu Leibovich who said that, he's troubled by the kotel, and he thinks that it's kind of a form of idolatry, that people aren't approaching the kotel for God, to commune with God, they're approaching the kotel to commune with the kotel. I similarly think that there's a nuance between thinking the Torah is holy and a vehicle for communicating with God, and worshiping the Torah and worshiping the text itself. And I think that is not what Judaism is about. And even if the text we have, word for word, is from the mouth of God and is divinely accurate, I still don't think it's meant to be worshipped. It's a tool. And I think an intellectually dishonest Judaism is an anti-historical Judaism. And clearly the Jews of the Second Temple period, like Chazal, felt a comfort to write Bible-like texts, right? Takeoffs like the Book of Jubilees. They were happy to acknowledge slight variations in the Tanakh. And the Masoretes, attest to that. They looked at it and said, we have tons of manuscripts and they don't match up. Let's try to make a coherent one. And I think we need to reclaim that sense of open-mindedness, or we do a terrible disservice to Tanakh and its history. So, thank you. If there are any questions or thoughts, feel free. Yeah.
I don't know if this is historically possible. Could it be that the people living there were escaping war or persecution weren't able to take the whole Tanakh with them and try to recreate scrolls from memory, so made mistakes? Is that ever been explored?
I mean, I would say it's less an issue. I mean, I think what you're hitting on, and to some extent, is the issue of memory, which is important in a lot of this, right? That a lot, like the transition from, or these people were able to remember a lot more text generally than we probably are able to do. And they relied on memorization, I think, much more heavily than modern culture, and certainly post-printing press. I don't necessarily know if it was kind of like in the haste of escape that they therefore needed to reproduce the text, as far as I know. But again, I think that I don't mean for the Dead Sea Scrolls to be confused that the texts that were circulating in non-Dead Sea circles were all the same. I think there were just as many variants there, but they weren't well preserved in pots and caves that we found. So I think that's part of the issue.
Are you able to elaborate a bit more on the positive impact of destabilizing our concept of
Sure.
revelation and transmission of
Sure.
scripture?
Well, I think I can first elaborate by the danger of what happens when you don't, which I really feel like I've experienced before. And I think the danger of that is that certain truths, certain areas are forbidden from being discussed. And I think the mention of scribes in certain circles is already considered to be apicorsis. That is heresy. And again, I think Chazal, the rabbis, They knew these guys, right? This was a historical, factual reality that there were scribes who copied. There were human beings like you or me who sat down and said, oh, you want me to commission me to write, Sefer Yechezkel for you? I'll do it, right? And they were paid to write these scrolls, and it was an occupation. And I think that, so on one level, I think it simply is a denial of reality that is dangerous because it rewrites, it kind of revises, I think, Jewish history to look the way no real history could look. And to say, there are these blank spaces where life was just pleasant and people, and I think that's very dangerous.
Why it's dangerous?
Why it's dangerous.
Yeah, I understand it's not historically
accurate, but
sophisticated, but what's the danger?
What's the danger?
Or what's the benefit? You don't have to answer now. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious. You seem like you're very passionate, so I want to tease it out a little bit.
That's fair. No, that's fair. Why is it dangerous? Well, on the one hand, and this, again, I don't think is exactly why it's dangerous, is the fact that I just don't think it's true to Judaism. I think that's something else. And in that sense, I think that's a danger if you would like to be a practicing Jew. I think that you're violating your duty if you don't interrogate your texts. I think the real danger is that it leads to fundamentalism. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't accept that there were manuscript differences and we're not quite sure if your Koran Tanakh was given on Har Sinai or not, therefore you're gonna, become a mass murderer. I'm not exactly sure that that's the equation, that that's what's at stake with this. But I'm not also barring that could be a possibility of what's at stake for this. But I think, again, believing that things are perfect is generally, I think, a bad idea. And I think that text is, first and foremost, a place where you can't necessarily believe that, especially one that's been transmitted. And these things go on, again, is there a danger in believing, right? Homeric studies is kind of the perfect place where people turn and see a parallel that since the emergence of the Iliad and the Odyssey, people have been trying to figure out what was the authentic manuscript that Homer was writing, or the people who were Homer was writing, right? And that's a popular parallel. And again, I'm not sure that fundamentalism, that people are going to be murderers because they feel really insistent that there was one true text of Homer. But again, I think it's a similar issue of if you start believing things like that and you're not even willing to open it up to questions and conversation, I think that we do fool ourselves into believing that the world is like a safe place. I do think that does become dangerous. Oh, yes.
Can these differences have meaning in the sense that it is possible that this was a sect and they were thinking differently and so they interpreted things differently? Or so it's not just random?
Definitely. I definitely think so. Right, there's the issue of scribal error, right, where people were trying to do their best and made a mistake. But I definitely think that there are texts where at least many scholars would say this is an intentional change. There's no way that the original really looked like that, and you just added in, a whole section. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. I'm not totally sure I can offhand, but yes. The short answer is, I think there are many instances in which they are intentionally embellishing the text for their purposes, and most scholars would be aware that could not have been kind of the original. The Samaritan Pentateuch that I alluded to before is a good example of that, because that makes for example, the Samaritan Pentateuch is a text that, again, includes the normal text of the Torah, and there are many instances in the Torah, which I think we sometimes overlook, where God commands Moses to do such and such, or to tell the people such and such, and the story goes on. It doesn't actually tell you that Moses carried that out, and we assume Moses carried that out, and it seems to fit in. And the Samaritan Pentateuch does not like that, and does not like the messiness of that. So they will come in and, I mean, it's an extremely boring document, I think, because it just repeats exactly verbatim, and Moses did exactly as it says. So you have whole paragraphs that are almost identical over and over, just to prove that Moses carried out the action that the text thinks you will infer happened. That's an instance where I think when you read it, it's almost too obvious for, I would argue, for anyone to think that that was the original. People could argue with that, certainly Samaritans, but other people as well. But yes, I think you're right. Did you have a question?
Yes. Why and when did these caves get closed?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know actually that much about the physical excavation, and I actually haven't seen the caves at Qumran myself. So I don't know why they were not stumbled upon sooner.
No, I mean to say, in their closure eons ago, what reason did they close them?
Physically closed, or meaning why were these scrolls like abandoned in them?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, I see.
They could have torched the place. They could have let it go to God.
You're right. Well, so the only thing I've really learned, I don't know the answer so clearly, but the only thing I've heard in relation to that is the idea that with the destruction of the Second Temple and the immediate exile and the war with the Romans, therefore this sect clearly disintegrated and dispersed and possibly just died out because at least by the time you joined the sect, you were no longer reproducing. So whatever issues came along with that, therefore, when they all kind of escaped Palestine, the cave remained.
I would have thought that those wonderful scrolls would have been disseminated
Right.
to scholars.
It's a fair point. I actually don't know the answer. Do you?
I think I know part of the
Please.
Some answer to this. So, the Dead Sea Scrolls are, correct me if anything's wrong, I haven't done major scholarly research into this, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are about dated around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. And the people of the Dead Sea sect were writing these scrolls day in, day out, and had hundreds of copies of some of these possibly, because that's mostly what they did as part of their devotion to God or their daily habit was rewriting a lot of these texts. So it's quite possible that they did take some with them and that they just left what they couldn't carry.
That's also, yeah. I mean, that ties in nicely also with the issue of Esther. Like, where did it go? And right, maybe there wasn't, I mean, again, I like the answer better that they had a theological problem with our version of Esther.
No, they use Purim time. They take it with them to.
There you go. They were exactly. So we know what month it was Adar, and yeah. So. Any other questions? Oh yes.
Is there like scientific progress being made on all this textual analysis, or is there are we narrowing? Are we like pruning the tree and like, okay, these theories are wrong and these theories are closer to correct, kind
Right.
of like in other areas of science, or are we just sort of like there's so many different ways to think about it? And
Right. Well, this is the main criticism that many other Bible scholars have of people who are text critics, which is even if you find one text that you think was more original, how are you ever going to get to the text? And this is really just about, multiplying the problems, which, I mean, I actually am satisfied with. I'm okay with not getting back to the final text. So is there progress being made? I mean, a lot of it is the progress of even seeing these comparisons. And I can't really speak for the field about what stage we are in right now. I can say kind of, and I wanted to bring it, but it's at school, but the book on this is called Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, which was written by this man, Emmanuel Tov, who's still alive in Israel. And it just has had its third edition. And this was he was the man, basically, one of the first people very involved in the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls when they came to light. And he really kind of pioneered a lot of this in terms of the way the scrolls relate to this issue. So again, there's a lot of work being done, but it's recent. The discovery of the scrolls is 60 years old. So all of this is kind of recent work. I can't say more specifically exactly what direction it's headed in yet. I don't know enough.
My impression is that there's some additional, there are new computational algorithms being developed for literary analysis. So in that sense, there might be scientific.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, guys.